Good morning.
Good morning to all ports of the world. Hi, Bob. How are you?
Good. How are you?
Good. How are you? Fine. So let me give you an introduction. So Bob is the president and CEO for Chair and Association Consultancy, and he is also advisor director in Global Mining Suitability, and he is reviewer and editor for nearly 20 plus journals, and he was doing with funded projects with more than $2 lakh. So it's a very brief profile about Bob. It's a lot to say about him. So I'm very happy for the Bob. Within very short time, he accepted our program, and he's willing to give us. Thank you, Bob. And the section here's to you. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks for the introduction and inviting me here. I've been doing a lot of research over the past several years, looking at the effects of mood states on judgmental processes. And one of the things that you might notice throughout my presentation is I switch back and forth between American English and British English. So sometimes judgment is spelled British and sometimes it's spelled American. So it's spelled American on this slide and it's spelled British on other slides. I don't know why I switch back and forth. I think it's because I go back and forth. Mostly I publish in American journals. And I want to thank a ton of people here who have been involved in this research with me, my collaborators. People have argued throughout history that there are benefits to good moods. And it makes sense. We like to feel happy. Yeah, we find mood congruency effects, mood congruent encoding and mood congruent retrieval. And what I mean by that is, Mark Snyder actually, it was Snyder and White in '81 who actually showed it first, but Gordon Bauer in '81 seemed to get all the credit for it. But the idea is that when you feel good, you tend to notice positive things in your environment. And when you feel sad, for example, you tend to notice negative things in your environment. So you're encoding material that's congruent with your mood. So what Bauer did in one study was he changed people's moods. He made some people happy and some people sad. So this is all, what I'm going to talk about today is all experimental. It's not like people come in and you just measure their moods and get them to do tasks. You actually experimentally induce the moods. I'll get to that later. And then he got them to learn a list of words, a long list of words. And the words, some of them were positive in nature, some of them were negative, and some of them were neutral. And they were all mixed up. And then later in neutral moods, he got them to recall as many words as they could. And the people that had induced happy moods recalled more positive words from the list, and the people who were initially in induced sad moods recalled more negative words from the list. So they'd encoded material, they'd encoded information that was consistent with the mood that they were in at the time of encoding. Mood congruent retrieval. Mark Snyder did, Snyder and White, what they did was they changed people's moods. They made some people happy, some people sad. And then they got them in a different situation while they were still in those moods to write about everything that they'd done the day before. And then they had judges evaluate the valence, that is, how negative to positive on a 7-point scale what these people had written was. Now, of course, the judges were blind to conditions, and the judges did this independently, so you get compute interjudge reliabilities. The interjudge reliabilities were quite high. They were above 0.8. So we took the mean of the two judges' ratings to indicate the score. And what he found was people who you'd induced happy moods to reported significantly happier events from yesterday than did people who were induced sad mood states. So that indicates that people will differentially recall information from the past as a function of what moods they're in. So mood congruent encoding, mood congruent retrieval. And this mood congruency issue is going to come up later in the talk when I talk about directions for future research. I just got to look at something here in one of my files because I want to pull it up. Sorry. And anyway, you get increased helping behavior. Eisen and her colleagues showed this. You get increased helping behavior when people are in happy moods. But it turns out, just as an aside here, that you only get increased helping behavior if the helping behavior doesn't interfere with the mood of the person who's helping somebody else. And that's important because we're going to return to that too. Quicker problem solving. Now, that's an interesting issue, that happy people solve problems more quickly. And that might indicate to me, thinking about this, that if you go fast, gee, maybe you might not be right all the time. So something to keep in mind. You get more free associates and more bizarre free associates with people in happy mood states. I'm not sure what to say about that, whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. Greater creativity. There's some evidence that people in happy moods tend to appear to be more creative. I can't see here. What can I do here? There. Okay. Broader categorization. And this kind of links to this greater creativity issue, is people in happy moods relative, and Eisen's work always involved happy and neutral. She really didn't have sad moods in there, at least initially in her research. Broader categorization. So people in happy moods were more likely to see, for example, a cane as an article of clothing, like a walking cane, you know, the thing that you'd use if you needed help walking. And I don't know, that broad categorization might mean that they're not discriminating. It might not be a good thing. It could, in fact, be a bad thing. And greater creativity, you can take creative approaches to things, but you may end up being wrong. So my question, I guess, obviously, from what I've been saying here is our good moods always good? And I want you to think about this for a while. People have argued that there are adaptive functions to good moods. And my question is, well, look, if we evolve to have good moods, happy mood, and mostly in this talk, I'm going to talk about happy and sad, okay? So just so you know that. But we've done work, you know, happy is active positive and sad is passive negative. But we've also done research where we've had passive positive like serenity and active negative like anxiety, and we get the same effects. Anyway, I figured, look, I'd been reading this literature and I said, well, if we evolved and there are some adaptive functions for good moods, there must be some adaptive functions for bad moods too. And again, I'm going to talk about sadness. So here's an example. If you think about guilt, you should be getting a feedback loop. And pardon me while I drink some coffee. If you do something that makes you feel guilty, you should be getting feedback from that. And that feedback should come back to you and say, gee, don't engage in this kind of behavior in the future. And so what you'd like to have happen if this feedback loop works is that a person doesn't engage in this behavior that made them feel guilty in the future. And for some people, the feedback loop works, and for others, it doesn't. This is my son when he was quite young, with a big fish that he caught. And this is my former dog, who died a few years ago. My son is now 6'2" tall. Now, the feedback loop with my son worked quite well. And it still does. He'd learn that he did something and I wasn't going to be happy, and he'd try not to engage in that behavior in the future. My dog, on the other hand, now anybody who doesn't think that there is dognition, like cognitive abilities in dogs, and anybody who doesn't think that dogs experience emotions has never owned a dog. Okay. Dogs learn know about 500 words, human words, and dogs certainly display emotions. So you're not anthropomorphizing when you talk about dogs having emotional responses. And pigs are smarter than dogs, just as an FYI. So my dog never learned the feedback loop. So if I left my dog at home too long, like most days when I came home from work, and you have to understand, when I was professing rather than doing what I'm doing now, I'd be in my office from 10 in the morning until at least 10 at night, and nobody was letting the dogs out. I had two of them. They were both like this. They're both wolf hybrids, mostly wolf, part dog, fantastic animals, very friendly, good with other people. But they didn't ever learn the feedback loop, the guilt feedback loop. Most of the days I'd come home and they'd jump all over me, "Dad, you're home," and they'd jump up and put their paws on my shoulders and lick my face. And some days I'd come home and there are no dogs. Well, I knew right away that meant that, the dogs have ripped my garbage apart, or the dogs have ripped my couch apart, or the dogs have done something else that I'm not going to be terribly happy about. And the dogs are hiding somewhere in the house. So obviously the dogs knew that what they did was not going to make me happy after they did it, and they took off and hid when I was coming home. Okay, so the point of having a feedback loop, a guilt feedback loop that works, is that before you say, "Gee, let's tear this couch up because we're mad at Dad because he left us for too long," you say, "Nah, Dad'll really be even more mad at us if we tear the couch up." So my son, who, like I said, is now 6'2", he's pretty good at that. My dog never got all that good at that. So are there adaptive functions for bad moods? And sadness, I'm gonna talk about a feedback loop here, is when you're feeling sad, that might indicate to you that things aren't going right in your life. And I'm not talking about depression here, okay? I'm just talking about the regular kind of sadness that you might experience on, sometimes we wake up, we just don't feel as happy as we would on other days. So it might tell you that, things just aren't going right in your life. And there is some evidence to support this in the area of work that was done by Abramson and Alloy years ago on mild depression and perceptions of control, is that mildly depressed people were accurate in perceiving when they had control, and non-depressed people thought they had control all the time, even when they didn't have control. And this involved a task where you had to push a sequence of buttons to turn lights on and off, okay? Well, in one condition, you really could push a sequence of buttons. In another condition, it was random, and the people who were mildly depressed knew when they could control it, knew when they couldn't, and the non-depressed people, pardon me, thought they had control all the time. So in some senses, mildly depressed people live in a realistic world, and non-depressed people live in a rose-tinted world. Now, anger and fear, they have adaptive functions too. Look, we get an adrenaline rush and a fight or flight response. We also get heuristic processing. You make quick judgments. And that goes back to this thing about, quicker problem solving with the happy people too, because sometimes heuristics don't work. So I'm going to argue in this talk that good moods can be bad and bad moods can be good. And what do I mean by that? I mean that good moods can lead to non-systematic, superficial, peripheral, heuristic processing and judgmental errors. And bad moods can be good. Sad moods can lead to systematic, detailed-oriented processing, cognitive elaboration, and judgmental accuracy. So in 1992, Mel Mark and I developed this model. And we argued that there were three pathways that mood states could affect judgments and action. And the first one I alluded to right now, or initially, so I'm gonna talk about it. Is just, well, I'm going to talk about all of them. But affective information is this idea that our moods give us feedback about the status of our lives. Norbert Schwartz and his colleagues developed some of this, it's also known as mood as information. And when you're feeling happy, you're getting feedback that says everything's fine, I make good judgments, and I don't need to pay attention to things. But when you're feeling sad, you're getting feedback that says, gee, there's something wrong in my life. I'm not making good judgments. I need to pay attention to things. And then mood maintenance, affect repair. This gets back to this idea. I want you to think about the example I gave you before of increased helping behavior when people were happy. But it turns out that increased helping behavior only worked, you only found the effect if the helping didn't interfere with the person's good mood. So the idea here would be that happy people might want to maintain their good moods. So not thinking about things in detail maintains their good moods. Not paying attention to something maintains their good moods. And that can lead them to process non-systematically and lead to judgmental errors. Whereas sad people might want to get out of their good moods. So what happens there is that they pay great attention to some kind of task which distracts them from their good moods. So they process systematically, they make better judgments, and making good judgments actually gets you out of your sad mood. And then the last one is cognitive capacity. Mackey and Worth and Mackey were the people who talked about this. And their argument was that that happy moods caused more information and more diverse information to come to mind. And what that did was it restricted working memory. So if you think of working memory as a piece of paper, and you've written everything you possibly could on that piece of paper, then what you're forced to do is to use shortcuts and heuristics, which can lead to process it to heuristic processing, non-systematic processing, because you just don't have any more capacity to process in detail, and that leads to poor judgments. What to just foreshadow here, the foreshadowing is none of the research that I've ever done supports cognitive capacity, okay? And none of the research that anybody else has done supports cognitive capacity. But back in 1992, it deserved to be in the model. Okay, mood inductions. We use tons of different kinds of mood inductions. Now, again, I want to reiterate, this is experimental research, so I can show cause and effect, okay? I can show whether happy versus sad moods cause X versus Y. And in fact, initially I started including neutral mood inductions. Kind of hard to say what a neutral mood is anyway. It's kind of a bizarre concept. But neutral always fell right between happy and sad on all of my dependent variables in my experiments. Sometimes it would differ from the happy group and not the sad group. Sometimes it would differ from the sad group and not the happy group. Sometimes it would differ from both the happy group and the sad group, but it was always in between. So eventually I just stopped using neutral control groups. And it also neutral tends to be more on the negative side of things anyway, in terms of affective state. I used a modified Velton mood induction procedure. If you go to my Google Scholar page, you can find a paper that describes it. Sometimes we use music. The easiest one that I found to use, and I think it was Fritz Strack who came up with this one. The easiest ones this autobiographical memory stuff is great, because all you do is you know, a lot of times we don't want people to know that what we're doing is trying to change their moods, okay? And when you use this Velton induction procedure, it's obvious that that's what you're trying to do. But with music, not necessarily. With autobiographic memory, it's great because you can set this up so you tell people, look, what we're trying to do is develop a new life events inventory for university students or college students. And just for those of you out there who aren't from anywhere other than the United States, in the United States, college means university. In Canada, where I live, college means something different than university. So in the States, I'd be saying college students. In Canada, I'd be saying university students. Anyway, so I'm going to develop we're developing a new life events inventory to be used in the future with university students. And what we found in the past when we've been developing these kinds of inventories, it's best to have people focus on one specific kind of event in their lives and write for about 15 minutes about this, or maybe we use 10 minutes, I forget. And so say, here's a box that has 200 slips of paper in it with 200 different types of life events. Please randomly pick one, and that's what you're going to write about. Now, of course, our box of 200 slips has 200 that say sad in it, sad event, or 200 that says happy event, because we're randomly assigning them to happy or sad mood induction conditions. But they don't know this. Right after after the mood inductions, we always, and in the example of the autobiographical mood induction I just described to you, we'll say to them, oh, by the way, because people are retrieving or remembering all sorts of different life events. One of the things we need to control for statistically is how you're feeling right now today. So we give them a 4-item mood measure, and that acts as our manipulation check. So it's a special dependent variable. It's a manipulation check to show that our manipulations were effective, and they're always like whoppingly effective. Okay, these mood inductions work fantastically. And we always use an unrelated second study paradigm. And what I mean by that is that there's always two experimenters, and they're conducting two different experiments in a single session, because neither experiments takes less than an hour. So each one takes about a half an hour, and the participants receive extra credit towards their final grades for each hour of participation. So we, put these two things together. Now, of course, they're related to one another, and we always set it up, or usually, depending on the study, that the mood induction ends up going first. And what we do is we have a rigged draw at the beginning of that session to decide on who goes up first that session. And of course, it's always the mood induction person. Person goes through the mood induction and they leave. They take off, and the second person takes over and does their study, which involves other parts of our manipulations and our dependent variables. Afterwards, we use a funnel type debriefing procedure where we assess and control suspicion. It turns out that if you do this well, nobody's ever suspicious that these two studies are related, or that you're looking at the effects of moods on judgment and mood restoration. I'll talk about that right now because I want to talk a little bit about ethical issues related to this kind of research. First of all, when you're recruiting participants for this kind of research, whether it be online or in classrooms at universities, you need to tell people in advance that they shouldn't sign up to participate in the study if they've been diagnosed with any affective disorders. And if they have, they know that they have been. University students are smart enough to know that if they've been diagnosed with depression, they have an affective disorder, or if they're bipolar, they have an affective disorder, okay? So that's important, because you don't want to take somebody who's suffering from clinical depression and bring them into an experiment, and they end up in a sad, negative mood state, inducing a negative mood state, and you have to take them off to the emergency room. Now, the other thing related to that is during this study, you really need to, and we can do this in large groups, okay? We have no problems running 80 people at a time, separated from one another, but you have to be vigilant. You have to watch for signs that it's possible that the SAD induction is affecting somebody more than you really want it to. Because ethically, you're bound not to make these people feel outrageously bad. We're just talking about average, everyday, happy and sad moods. And so you've got to keep an eye on that, and you've got to be ready to say, go up to somebody and say, are you okay? Is this fine? And if they aren't, stop them. Okay. And you take them outside and you debrief them, and you put them through a mood restoration. So other ethical issue here is, look at when we recruit people, there's deception. But in this kind of research, there has to be deception for a couple of reasons. Yet we don't want demand characteristics. So we don't want that our participants to start to try and develop hypotheses about what we want to show. Because generally speaking, Martin Orange showed years and years ago, is people will give you what they think you want. Now, more often than not, the hypotheses that people would actually develop in this area of research that I do aren't the hypotheses that I have. So the most straightforward hypothesis isn't what I'm predicting anyway. So they always know that they are participating in two different experiments. They always know exactly what's going to go on when you recruit them, but they sign two separate consent forms that are printed in different fonts and worded slightly differently, et cetera, keep these things separate in their minds. So you can justify this kind of deception to ethics review boards for the reasons I just explained. And again, we tell them exactly what's going to happen to them. We just don't tell them that the two studies are actually one study. The debriefing. Debriefing is very important here because, first of all, you need to put on a bit of a show, a dog and pony show, to get everybody up and happy and explain. And you're also ethically bound if you work by APA standards, American Psychological Association standards, to have participants learn something from their participation in your research. No, participants might want to just get out and leave, but you're bound ethically for them to learn something, okay? So you need to explain a bit about the effects of mood on judgment, and you need to explain what you were studying today, and you need to explain what you expected to find and why, so that they learn something. And then you put everybody through a happy mood induction, even the people that were already happy. Now, I know I argued that people in sad moods are going to make better judgments, but let's have everybody, well, 10 minutes, we'll have them write about happy things in their lives so that everybody leaves the lab happy. The last thing is you need to get vows of silence from these participants. And you might think that that's difficult to do, but turns out it isn't. If you actually tell the participants that, you know, without people like you, science could not progress. And this is, you know, we appreciate absolutely everything about the time that you spent here today. And it's very important for science to progress that people don't know what we're studying today. So it's really important that you don't let anybody else know. You know, if somebody asked you, you know, how was that study? You can say, oh, there were two studies and we did this and we did that. That's fine, but just don't tell them what we're studying. And you know, because you are contributing to science, and this is great. So if you do that kind of thing, you get them to buy into the fact that they're part of the whole process, and they're far less likely to go out there and start blabbing about what you're studying. So what I'm going to talk about now are the central tenet of the model, and that is that mood state affects processing strategy, and that affects judgment and action. So mood and responsiveness to affective primacy in the context of employee selection. And what we did was this. We induced happy or sad moods in people, and then we had them read 32 behaviors that were exhibited by a job candidate. 16 were positive and 16 were negative. We varied the order that people read these so that half got more positive information first, half got more negative information first. And then later, in neutral moods, people evaluated the competency of the candidate and retrieved all of the information that they could about the candidate. And what we expected, what we found was happy people were most responsive to the primacy manipulation. Okay, so, you know, people in a happy condition rated the guy much more positively, was a guy. So more positively if they got initial positive information, and much more negatively if they got initial negative information. Sad people, that difference is not significant. I should have put error bars on these things, but I was lazy. Anyway, for the sad people, there's no difference. Information distortion. Happy people distorted information towards whatever initial information they received was, and sad people didn't. We did something similar, but we varied the attractiveness of the target person in an employee selection context. And we induced happy or sad moods, and people were presented with a dossier for a job candidate. There was a photograph attached to the dossier, and it was either an attractive or an unattractive male candidate. They read all the behaviors that I've mentioned before, randomized. And then later in neutral moods, they evaluated the candidate's competency. And happy people are most responsive to the attractiveness manipulation. So look, happy people are paying attention to cues that are pretty much irrelevant, okay? Sad people are paying attention to the relevant information. And there, that pretty much says it all. Mood and performance appraisal. Sinclair, 1988. This was actually the first study that I'm talking out of order here because it makes talk flow better. I'm not talking in chronological order of publications. I was 10 years old when I did this study, just so you know. And for anybody who's trying to figure out how old I am. And anyway, this was the first study that ever showed the difference in information processing between happy and sad people. So what we did was this. Participants read 32 behaviors that were exhibited by an employee. 16, and it's like this, we talked about this before. 16 were positive and 16 were negative. 4 behaviors mapped onto 8 job-related behavioral categories. And what we did was, in those 8 categories, we varied the number of behaviors that were positive or negative across the categories. So in some categories, there were all positives. In some, there were all negatives. In some, there were 3 positives and 1 negative. In some, there were three negatives and 1 positive. In some, there were 2 and 2, et cetera, et cetera. You understand what I'm saying? So for example, now what we told students was that they were expert judgments of expert evaluators of teaching behavior of university professors. So these behaviors were behaviors that university professors exhibited. So for example, on preparation and organization, the person might have 4 positive behaviors, but on delivering lectures, the person might have 4 negative behaviors. So on other dimensions, other categories, we varied the number of positive and negative behaviors in each of those categories. And we developed these behaviors were developed in the same manner that you develop items for a behaviorally anchored rating scale, okay? Just so you know how we develop these things. They took a long time to develop. And then people were exposed to happy, neutral, or sad moods, and they evaluated the target's performance on each of the categories, and we got them to do an overall global performance appraisal. Accuracy scores were computed based on within subject correlations between the number of positive behaviors in each behavioral category. So remember those 8 categories, like preparation and organization versus delivering lectures, and the participants' job performance ratings on each of the categories. And HALO was also measured based on the average inter-item correlations among the ratings on the behavioral categories. And what would I expect? Well, you know, if happy people aren't paying attention to things, okay, they're going to be less accurate. And sad people are, they're going to be more accurate. And HALO is a problem in performance appraisals because it's when evaluators fail to discriminate across categories. And they rate somebody as high across the board, moderate across the board, or poor across the board in terms of their job performance. And we all know that in most organizations, there aren't very many people who are good at everything. They actually are good at some things and not so good at others. So sad people were in fact most accurate and displayed least HALO. And the other thing is that more of the behavioral categories entered into a stepwise regression predicting global performance ratings for sad people than for happy people or people in neutral moods. And up here with accuracy, neutral is in between the two, just to point that out. So, I mean, what this says, this regression analysis says, is that, you know, the sad people were thinking more about stuff. And obviously the accuracy measure, they were more accurate. So there's basically what we found. And there's what we found in terms of HALO. Okay, we did another study. And we varied whether, in fact, there was true HALO or not. So people in induced happy or sad moods read about behaviors that were exhibited by an employee. The target behaviors varied so that one target displayed true HALO and the other target displayed no HALO. And sad people displayed HALO when HALO was appropriate, but they also displayed no HALO when no HALO was appropriate. Happy people displayed HALO all of the time. And there, that sort of says it. You could argue a bit about our measures of accuracy. So in 1995, so I was 10 in 1988. So what, in 1985, 1995, I was 17 years old. And Mel, Mark, and I did this study. What we did was, I was teaching a research methods class when I was in graduate school, how in other areas in the world other than Canada and the United States, you would say postgraduate school. So I was teaching a research methodology course. And at the beginning, and that particular day, we were supposed to be having a lab in the laboratory experience going on in the class. And I said to people, look, we're going to do our first lab today. And what I'm trying to do is determine whether this new method of mood induction that I've developed is actually effective. Okay, so I was just straightforward with them that we were looking at mood induction. And we induced happy, neutral, and mood and sad mood states in everybody. They were randomly assigned to conditions, obviously. And we measured their moods, and that was it. And then I said, you know, we've got our first exam coming up next week. And as an aside, they were going to have to write this all up as a lab experiment. And they ended up having to write it all up as a lab experiment, but just so you know. Anyway, I said, yeah, you seem to be somewhat confused. Some of you have come to my office, and there seems to be some confusion about issues related to correlations and correlation coefficients and the concept associated with correlations. So I'm going to hand out a bunch of scatter plots. And what I did was I had a page that had 9 scatter plots on it. And those scatter plots varied so that they would suggest a very strong positive correlation all the way down to a very weak positive correlation, to a very weak negative correlation, to a very strong negative correlation. And all I asked them to do was estimate the magnitude and direction of the correlation coefficient, and I got them to do a couple of other things. Now, what I did was I used mean squared deviation from the 2 correlation as the index of accuracy. SAD people were most accurate. I also asked them to provide descriptions about their strategies. They provided the most accurate strategies. They wrote the most when describing how they came up with their estimates. They provided the most accurate descriptions of the concepts of correlations, and they provided accurate examples. When I asked them, I also asked them to provide examples of positive and negative correlations. SAD people were most creative in their examples, but they were least accurate, and they were least accurate in their descriptions of the concept. So, you know, SAD people would say, you know, there's a positive correlation between, I'm just making this up right now, but, you know, there's a positive correlation between ice cream sales and shark attacks, which in fact there really is. So that means that eating ice cream causes you to get attacked by sharks. Okay, and that's just, look, I'm thinking about something from years ago. Anyway, well, what about, and I mentioned this earlier, what would happen if we induce moods that were active versus passive by positive versus negative? Okay, so we got a 2x2 factorial here. And that's what, so our active moods here were, our active positive was happiness. Our active negative was anxiety. Our passive positive was sadness, and our passive negative was depression. And we replicated everything that I described above. There was a marginal main effect for activity, with low activity leading to greater accuracy, but there was no interaction. I don't want to talk about that. Okay, so are you buying the central tenet of my model that mood affects processing strategy and that affects judgment and action? I hope so. If not, I'm not giving a very good talk. Let's talk about mood maintenance and affect repair. And again, remember, mood maintenance and affect repair was the idea that people in happy moods don't pay attention to things because doing so distracts them from their happy moods, and sad people pay attention to things because it distracts them from their sad moods, and also making better judgments makes them get out of their sad moods. They repair their sad moods. That's just what I just said, so you don't have to spend too much time reading it. Okay, if this is the case, happy people might process systematically if they believe that doing so will be mood maintaining. We showed, we've shown, and other people have shown this, you know, evidence for this mood maintenance affect repair issue. So we decided to look at this as, what if we made happy people think that paying attention to a task would make them feel happy. So I wanted a brief overview of the literature on mood and persuasion. Rich Petty and his colleagues have done some of this stuff, and Dwayne Wagner, me, and Petty and Cacioppo talk about low need for cognition people, and they have a scale that measures this. And low need for cognition people who are people who don't pay attention to persuasive messages. So these are the kind of people who aren't going to process in detail messages that are directed at them to persuade them. So they're also going to be more likely to be persuaded by what we would call peripheral messages, like, I'm not a doctor, but I play one on TV. Or the person presenting a product on television is, so this has implications in marketing and consumer behavior. A person presenting, an ad for a product is attractive, okay? And so the people that are low need for cognition respond, they view the product as more positive if it's presented by an attractive person or by someone who looks like an expert or sounds like an expert. They're working with peripheral cues, okay? Things that are really not related to the message. But high need for cognition people are people who elaborate or pay attention to persuasive messages, and they're not affected by these peripheral cues. And actually, Chaikin and Eagley came out with a similar model at about the same time, where they talk about systematic versus heuristic processing, where the heuristic people would be like low need for cognition, and the systematic people would be like the high need for cognition. So my argument is that, the happy people are like low need for cognition people, and the sad people are like high need for cognition people. So if I present strong and weak arguments to happy and sad people, what should happen is that happy people won't pay attention to the arguments, and they won't be persuaded by strong versus weak arguments because they don't pay attention to the arguments anyway. But sad people, if you present strong arguments, they'll be persuaded. But if you present really weak and foolish arguments, they'll counter-argue them and actually reject that position. And and if you get that pattern of effects, that indicates that the sad people were in fact paying attention to the arguments and the happy people weren't. So this is the typical kind of effect that we find in the area of mood state and attitudes, is that sad people who are presented with strong arguments actually evaluate an issue or a product or a person more positively than weak arguments. And the happy people just fail to discriminate between strong and weak arguments. So under the guise of an impression formation study, people read about a likable or dislikable source of arguments who was advocating the institution of comprehensive final examinations for graduating university students. And we measured likability, and happy or sad moods were induced in people, and we measured moods. And then people read either strong or weak arguments advocating comprehensive exams. And then afterwards, attitudes were measured. We got a thought listing to measure cognitive responses. and likability was measured a second time. Now, what we thought here when we designed this study was, look, if people in happy moods were exposed to a likable person, a person who said nice things about university students, they'd pay attention to the arguments. But if the person was dislikable, they wouldn't pay attention to the arguments. But for sad people, we figured they'd pay attention to the arguments regardless of likability. And what did we find? Happy people elaborated arguments from the likable source, so they did pay attention to them, and they were persuaded by strong but not weak arguments. Happy people failed to discriminate arguments from the dislikable source and were equally persuaded by strong and weak arguments. Sad people elaborated regardless of whether the source of the arguments was likable or dislikable, and they were persuaded by strong but not weak arguments. I want you to think for a second here. Think back to cognitive capacity with this Mackey and Worth and Mackey explanation for mood effects. Is, well, if happiness, just fills up working memory, why would being exposed to a likable source all of a sudden free up working memory so that happy people would pay attention to the arguments? See, cognitive capacity is not a sensible explanation. And that's the effect I just described, blah, blah, blah. I don't really need to spend too much time having you look at this because I described it. The problem with this study is we assumed that likability affected the expectations of happy people regarding the quality of arguments that the source would present. And we didn't ever measure that. So the solution was to replicate the study, but measure expectations about the quality of arguments. And sure enough, happy people expected strong and convincing arguments from a likable source and weak and unconvincing arguments from the dislikable source. Sad people's expectations were orthogonal to, they were unrelated to what their beliefs, their expectations about the quality of arguments. There you go. So these do support this mood regulation, mood maintenance, affect repair facet of the model. So good moods can be good some of the time. If you think that you'll enjoy thinking, then I think you'll probably think. So again, like I said, no, doesn't support cognitive capacity. So a more direct test of the capacity issue. Participants read about a likable or dislikable source of arguments, and then happy moods were induced. Participants read strong or weak arguments advocating comprehensive exams under cognitive load or no load, okay? And we measured attitudes. In the load condition, happy people used likability as a peripheral cue and were marginally more persuaded by the likable source. In the no load condition, happy people elaborated arguments from the likable source, but not the dislikable source. So, no, there's really little support for cognitive capacity. And then, previous, Okay, so there's me when my hair was brown, naturally brown. I was 18 years old in this picture. The smiling face and a happy face. And the headline says, too happy for their own good. I'm going to get in here to read this. Upbeat workers less effective than sad workers, research finds. And so there's an article in the front of the Edmonton Journal, front page of the Edmonton Journal, describing some of the research that was going on in my lab. But it said something that I never said, and it reported results that I've never found. But notice this, that's Mick Jagger up there and me down here. So Mick Jagger and I are on the front page together of the Edmonton Journal. And for those of you who are music buffs, I got to see my smiling face on the cover with a Rolling Stone. Mood state and employee productivity. I don't know if, to be honest with you, I don't know if Kerry's ever going to finish this work. I think that it's too bad because it's such beautiful work. It's brilliant research, but it's her dissertation, and it's been done for a while, and it was under review for a while, and I guess she just didn't want to deal with it. But I'll tell you about it because it's beautiful research. We trained people to build circuit boards. And then we induced happy or sad moods. And then we got them to build circuit boards. And we measured performance. Pretty simple study. There's me. I was 19. And there's Kerry. And there's the circuit boards. So what are these, like, little kids things that you buy at an electronics store for teaching kids about circuits? And then we had instructions and that sort of thing. And here's what we found was there were no difference in the number of steps completed, but sad people made fewer errors than happy people. So in fact, yes, sad workers are better workers in certain situations. So we hypothesized that part of the difference here might be motivation for mood maintenance in happy people and affect repair in sad people. So we replicated the previous study, but we also measured mood immediately after the mood induction and after completing the circuit board. And we found that happy participants maintained their positive mood after the assembly task, while sad people engaged in affect repair. So we replicate the same difference in performance, but look what happens with happy versus sad. Sad people are engaging in affect repair. Happy people, nothing much going on. So sad people also reported significantly greater satisfaction with the task, and they self-report better, more accuracy too. In a third study, we provided untrained students with expectations about the affective consequences of performing the task, that it would maintain their mood, that we gave them no expectation, or that it would attenuate their mood. And we found the typical error effects that we found in the no expectation condition. But sad people who thought that the task would maintain their sad moods performed poorly. Sad people who believed that the tasks would make them feel better performed well. Happy people who thought that the tasks would maintain their moods performed well, but if they thought that the task would be mood attenuating, that is, to make them feel worse, they performed poorly. So there. So happiness is not it's all cracked up to be, blah, blah, blah. So good moods can be good when expectations about completing tasks are affectively positive. And I think pretty much the last thing I want to talk about today is this affect is information or mood is information effect extended to processing strategy effects. Sinclair, Mark, and Clure, 1994, was the first time we looked at some of this. And I already explained the idea to you. So happy moods provide information that situations are benign, that current decision-making processes are inadequate, and that less energy needs to be devoted to judgment. Sad moods provide information that situations are threatening or important, that current decision-making processes are inadequate, and that judgments, and that we need to devote energy to judgments. So what we did here was, this is the only study where we use kind of a naturally occurring mood induction, and that was the weather. It's pleasant, it was pleasant or unpleasant. So we sent our lab assistants, or I sent my lab assistants out on either nice weather days or unpleasant weather days, and I had them read. We measured their mood, but for half of them, what we said was, we were just interested in measuring your mood today. For the other half of them, we said, well, we were interested in measuring your mood today because, the weather can affect how you feel. Okay. So some people have no attribution for how they feel. We just said, we just wanted to measure your mood. And half the people have an attribution. That is, well, I feel the way I do, but it's because of the weather. I'm happy because of the weather, or I feel kind of down because of the weather. And then we read them 3 strong or 3 weak arguments advocating comprehensive exams. Now, this is what I predicted, okay? In the no attribution condition, where people have no explanation for the moods, we'd get exactly what we found in the past, is that people on unpleasant weather days who feel, down would pay attention to the arguments, and people on unpleasant days, so if they got strong arguments, they'd be persuaded. If they got weak arguments, they wouldn't be persuaded. On pleasant weather days, in the no attribution condition, it wouldn't matter what the arguments were because these people wouldn't pay attention. What about the situation where you give them an external attribution? Well, you say, yeah, I feel good, but it has nothing to do with my life. It has to do with the weather. Or I feel bad, but it has nothing to do with my life. It has to do with the weather. Well, then they should pay a moderate amount of attention to the arguments, and both on pleasant and unpleasant days, you should get a persuasion effect. So I'm predicting a 3-way interaction, and that's exactly what I found. Previous. Next. Just to drive this home. Okay, so you know what? It's always nice when you predict a 3-way interaction and you get it. So good moods aren't bad when they're not informative. Well, again, let's think about cognitive capacity. It makes no sense. Cognitive capacity is making no sense as an explanation, because why would it be the case that all of a sudden when you have an external attribution for your mood, that is, well, I feel this way because of the weather, boom, working memory frees up? It makes no sense. Are moods necessary for mood effects? Affective cues might provide information about the nature of situations and processing requirements without affecting mood. And this is the idea of processing, of cognitive tuning. Now, I'm going to skip through this pretty quickly and just get to the end. What I really mean by this, though, is imagine that you're walking down the street and you notice somebody who's got kind of a scowl on their face, and you're walking down the sidewalk. You probably wouldn't notice the way they had a scowl on their face today because they got a mask on. But you might, it doesn't affect how you feel, but you might move out of, you might move out of the way a little bit. And it's a cue from the environment. And imagine another situation, somebody's got a smile on their face. Well, it might not affect how you feel, but you wouldn't move out of the way. So there are cues, affective cues out there all the time. My grad student, Alex Soldat, did I just got him to replicate this because I couldn't believe it. I'd say, okay, do it again. It was really easy data to collect. And he did things like get people to solve graduate record exam like questions on different colored paper. He found this kind of red paper that seemed to convey positive affect, and this blue paper that can seem to convey negative affect. There was no difference in readability, and there were no differences in nothing. They didn't affect how people felt if we measured people's moods, but there were differences in the affect associated with this particular color, red, versus this particular color, blue. And for some reason, these papers, these color papers that Alex is first author on, are being cited left, right, and center now. I just got a notification the other day from ResearchGate. Says, congratulations for 2,000 reads of this particular paper. I sent the congratulations to Alex. I said, I can't believe it. And anyway, it turns out that people in schools of architecture are really interested in this stuff. Go figure. So anyway, look, the bottom line in this is he always gets effects where the people who get the blue paper perform better, and they respond to persuasive messages more, and on and on and on. So I'm not even going to talk about it. But this one is kind of cool. Under the guise of a speech addressing impromptu, or a study addressing impromptu speeches, participants read strong or weak arguments aloud to Confederates. These are people working with us, but they think, the participants think that their other participants who either responded with a favorable or a serious facial expression. So basically, we set it up so that there was a rigged draw, like you're drawing out of a box, so that the participant always was the person giving the speech, and our Confederate, the person working with us who was posing as another student, was always the person who was the audience member. And he or she either sort of nodded like this, or they looked serious at him when he was giving the speech. And we measured attitudes. And in the serious condition, that the person giving the speech paid attention to the attitudes, was persuaded by paid attention to the arguments, was persuaded by strong arguments, and counter-argued and rejected weak arguments. In the favorable condition, nothing happened. So in the next study that Alex did, he presented these faces. Let me just back up here, because this one is actually worth talking about. He had people read strong or weak arguments that were presented on a computer screen, but the arguments served as masks that were for photographs of smiling or serious faces that were presented below threshold of awareness. That is for only 13 milliseconds. And we measured attitudes. So there's an example of a happy face and a sad face. So we had a bunch of different ones. And sure enough, even when these things are presented out of awareness and they don't affect how people feel themselves, what happened was in the serious condition, the serious looking condition, or the sad looking condition, people pay attention to the arguments and are persuaded by strong arguments and reject weak arguments. These differences here were not significant in the smiling condition. We replicated this study, and we also measured cognitive responses. I'm not going to bother talking about this for much time. So good cues can be bad, and bad cues can be good. So are moods necessary for mood effects? Maybe. Then again, maybe not. I don't have time to talk about this. I've been talking for too long. Conclusions. Mood states engender different processing strategies that can affect judgment and behavior. This can be adaptive. It affords us the ability to cope with our environments. Happiness can lead to non-systematic processing. Sadness can lead to systematic processing. Happy people will devote attention to tasks when they believe that doing so will be mood maintaining. The effects of mood on judgment and behavior are attenuated when moods are not informative. There's little support for the restricted capacity explanation for mood effects. So the model needs to be kind of revised to look like this. Other thing, affective cues operate like mood states. The potential method, it's a potential method for us coping with our environment. So moods aren't necessary for mood effects. The other thing that I think is really important here is we addressed a ton of theoretical issues in situations that used applied independent variables. So things like performance appraisal, job selection, accuracy, productivity. So you can answer theoretical questions and do it in the context of applied situations. And that's the beauty of doing experimental research. So good moods and cues can be bad. Bad moods and cues can be good, but sometimes good moods can be good. And that's all, folks.
Thank you so much. Closing this.
Anybody there?